And reason also becomes, it also differs for Hegel from Kant in that it becomes identified in a macrocosmic way with the absolute, with the spirit. Reason is the tool that the absolute, the spirit, uses to create the world on the one hand, but it's also the divine spark that it is implanted in the human mind, that the human mind can learn how to use through cultivation and through the process of an education. And this book is basically a disguised Bildungsroman. The novel of education was popular in the 18th century. Hegel had grown up reading things like Rousseau's Emile and Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. So it's a hidden Bildungsroman, a self-education, whereby reason then becomes the privileged faculty that is the tool of the spirit by means of which it can use to sublate these other inferior oppositions of the intellect and rise to a higher plane. So those are some fundamental distinctions between Hegel and Kant right out of the starting gate. And so that's the structure of the book in terms of the two halves. And the first half is composed in terms of three separate units. Everything in Hegel occurs in triads. He's absolutely enamored with triads, especially the thesis, antithesis, synthesis triad that he's become famous for in his dialectic. And the first half of the book, we note, is divided into the three sub-units, or what he calls moments of consciousness, or what he calls moments. A is consciousness, which is the thesis. B is self-consciousness, which is its antithesis. C then is reason, which is the synthesis of the both, taken up and sublated into a higher perspective. Then we begin a second half with BB, which is spirit, and then that deals with the outer world of the evolution of consciousness through human history and the development of institutions, and then CC with religion and his theory of religion also having three stages, just as history has three stages, so religion has three stages. And then the book concludes with DD, absolute knowing. Now what I want to do, the whole progression of the thing, now take note, is a movement of from soul to spirit. Hegel is he's trying to climb the heights. This is one of the reasons why I chose for the iconic logo for this series, Caspar David Friedrich's image of the ascent up the mountain there with the Christ cross is at the top of the mountain. That's basically the realm of the spirit that one will attain once one ascends the Mount Purgatory, as it were, here of Hegel's philosophy, and ascends to its omega point and learns how to think in terms of the reason and its conceptual categories, learns how to think in larger terms, will be able to see the vista of human history and the vista of human cultural institutions down beneath him. So the whole process is a recasting of the Platonic motif of the ladder of knowledge that moves through a sequence. Remember that Plato moved through a sequence from the realm of illusion, such as when we put a stick in water and it's refracted and we see that it's bent and we mistake that illusion of refraction for the essence of the thing, to what he calls sensible particulars, which are simply these things that we see through the senses and that would correspond to science's a positivistic model of seeing and holding these things and then testing them and verifying them. So this is merely a positivistic, purely sensory theory of knowledge, to intelligible particulars, which have to do with mathematics, where you can't perceive these forms. They're only perceived by the mind's eye, but they are intelligible particulars nonetheless, to ultimately the great universals of the Platonic ideas. So that's Plato's ladder to knowledge that Hegel is recasting here in the Phenomenology of the Spirit, and its ascent from soul to spirit, from the finite empirical circumstances of average, ordinary, everyday consciousness, what Husserl will later call the natural attitude, that is convinced that everything that appears to it through the senses is real, to the gradual, he moves from the finite human to the universal human consciousness, in which subjectivity has been purged out bit by bit as one ascends and arrives at the realm of the spirit and thinks in terms of the realm of the forms, the ideal absolutes. So this is a recasting, not only of Schelling, but a recasting of the Platonic ascent up the ladder of knowledge. Now I'm going to take Jean Hippolyte's advice here and skip over the preface. As he says in this book, and also as one of the commentators here in the foreword says, the preface was written after the book. It was the last thing written. And it's harder to understand if you start with it. And it was written specifically it was specifically designed to connect the phenomenology to his next book, The Science of Logic. The Science of Logic is his next book, which comes out, I believe, in 1812. That's followed in 1817 by his third major work on the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences and Outline, of which this is to be regarded as an introduction, even though Hegel says there can be no introduction to such a philosophy as this. But I want to skip that and go directly to the introduction now and discuss the introduction. It's very short, it's only 10 pages, but it's dense and it's absolutely crucial to understand so that you can understand everything that follows from it. In the introduction begins by basically a discussion of skepticism that Hegel refutes. He says that it's a natural assumption that in philosophy, before we start to deal with its subject matter, the primary concern that we want to be concerned with is the tool of cognition, the instrument of cognition that we're going to use to understand the object of study, which in this case is the absolute. Philosophy for Hegel is the construction of the absolute out of concepts. So the absolute is, as it were, the corpse on the table that we are now, like in Rembrandt's anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, are going to now carve up with our conceptual apparatus, which of course the critical philosophy inaugurated by Kant has now come into being to question now. Critical philosophy is the beginnings of the questioning of knowledge, knowledge questioning itself, questioning the tools that it uses to analyze what it analyzes, and changes in doing so. Whatever tool you're using will of necessity change the outcome of the object that you're studying. This is something we take for granted nowadays, as in the case of, let's say, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or in hermeneutics. And in hermeneutics, note that this is the essence. The very position that Hegel is refuting here has become the primary position of hermeneutics, which is to say the whole postmodern mentality, which is the idea that the tools that you use to understand a system change the knowledge of the object of the system and change it irrevocably in such a way that you can never use a tool that will give you a privileged Archimedean point outside the system that you're studying. So there is no real ultimate object behind what we're studying. We're always studying a construct, a mental construct that is in accordance with a certain language game, a certain game of rules, and we play by those rules and we arrive at supposedly objective truths, although they are not objective anymore, according to hermeneutics, except insofar as they are system dependent. That is the position, more or less, that I think that Hegel starts off by refuting. Skepticism he regards as one of the incomplete aspects of consciousness on the way stations, and he says here, he moves right into saying that this book is laid out as though it were a series of stations of the soul going through like Christ going through the stations of the cross. There are a given number of stations of the cross, and here it will turn out in this book that there are 8 of them. And this is a journey of the soul along a road at which it will encounter itself in each of these stages, and it will be dissatisfied and incomplete and alienated from itself at each of these stages until it arrives at the ultimate omega point, the ultimate point of absolute knowledge, that is to say, of philosophy. That is the point that it will arrive at its full completion once it gets to. But note here that he's stating this in terms of religious language, and I think one of the things that we could say about Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is not only is the book a disguised Bildungsroman, a disguised novel of education which was current in Hegel's time, it is also in many ways, I think, a recasting, maybe not consciously on Hegel's part, but it is a recasting of Dante's descent down through hell, up Mount Purgatory, and onward to the White Rose. And in that sense, as the book opens up, we're at the base of the mountain here. We've got 2 roads. The one is the road of doubt and skepticism and the merely natural attitude that thinks there is nothing that can be known that isn't just purely sensory, sensible sense data, and that's really the true path of knowledge. But that eventually leads to skepticism and doubt about arriving at any kind of knowledge at all, versus his path, which is the privileged path toward the absolute on the road that will lead us to reason. And that is, it's very much like the opening of Dante's Inferno when he's starting out and he's getting ready to descend down into the underworld. The first 2 moments down, in other words, that correspond to hell, Hegel's hell, are consciousness and self-consciousness, because consciousness is the consciousness of the object. It is the self's consciousness of the object and its attempt to dominate over it using conceptual discourse, the laws of science. It dictates to being, Self-consciousness turns out to be the relationship to we, the we rather, the relationship to others, what Heidegger calls the Mitwelt, the relationship to others, whereby self-consciousness can only develop itself insofar as it encounters an other self, a we. That's basically his hell, his inferno. And purgatory begins when he arrives at their synthesis in reason, which is section C, when he begins to take up those 2 points of view. And always when he takes up something that he's previously negated, it returns later on transformed on a higher spiral, so that consciousness will then return as observant reason, which is the theoretical attitude of science in terms of its teleological concern with final causes, which will represent a sublative transformation of consciousness, where self-consciousness will return on a higher turn of the spiral, which ends up in alienated forms of thinking like Stoicism and Skepticism, in which we end up with an alienated consciousness that's cut off from the other, that's cut off from relationship to anyone else, and that is, of course, hell. Hell is the realm of egos cut off from other individuals. But by the time we get to reason, this will return in his purgatory. Reason corresponds to his purgatory. This will return as active reason or practical reason, the realm of morality and ethical duty and so forth. And then we will begin to move into his paradiso, his heaven, with spirit and religion as we ascend up the mountain. And by the time we get to the top of the mountain, we will be at the realm of absolute knowing. And the absolute knowing is the white rose. It corresponds to Dante's white rose that we will arrive at the end of this journey. So this is very much a disguised spiritual allegory of the soul's ascent toward the spirit. But now he says that the goal of notion, and what he does here, he begins by invoking what Heidegger calls the correspondence theory of truth, in which notion corresponds to object, or concept corresponds to object, and object corresponds to concept. But now the central anxiety of Hegel will be the degree to which the concept will correspond to the object. It's not just a simple matter as it is for Kant of truth is the agreement of our concepts with the objects that we encounter, because for Hegel, the knower, the knowing consciousness is unstable in the sense that it's always going through transformations. It's always at a particular stage. It's always at one of these way stations. And so how it understands the object that it's studying it will change the nature of the object. When you change whatever stage you happen to be at in the dialectical journey of the soul, the dialectical journey of consciousness, that stage will change the nature of the object that is being studied. And so it will not be the same object depending on what stage of consciousness you're at here, until you do ultimately get to the final level, which is his level of absolute knowing, whereby the object corresponds perfectly, or rather the concept, the notion one has of the object corresponds perfectly to what the object really actually is. So he believes that there is such a thing as an ultimate truth, an ultimate foundation that the mind can eventually arrive at through a long and wayward journey, can eventually arrive at to attain ultimate truth, which is something that we in the postmodern age no longer believe in. The only difference between this idea, and you can see, I think, the influence of Hegel and Gadamer, this idea that knowledge is something that is a construct that changes the nature of the object depending on what phase or stage of its development it's at, is basically consistent with hermeneutics and basically consistent with the postmodern attitude, except that there is no final goal. There is no absolute as a transcendental signified, the omega point that we can arrive at the end of the journey, whereby we can say, oh, my concept of the object perfectly corresponds with the in itself of the object, with that which it really is, and now I've attained absolute truth. There is no longer, for us postmoderns, any such in itself to grasp at. We're living in an age without foundations, a groundless age, in which the object that is studied is always more or less true, more or less there or not. You know, Heidegger's aletheia theory, in which truth is a matter of degrees, and there's something always slipping out of our grasp, and so we can never pretend to have any kind of absolute knowledge of any system or any object in the phase and stage and age in which we're living nowadays. So he makes this fundamental distinction here, and it's absolutely crucial to grasp between the in itself and the for itself of the object. The object is, on the one hand, we can say of the object that it is in itself, that it's something in itself, that it has a being in itself that corresponds to its essence. And the essence of the object is what it really is in and of itself. That is truth.